But now let's start. Very happy to announce the keynote of Michael Brown. He was flying over from Los Angeles, where he joined in August 2015 Optimist Design, a studio designing sets and environments for brands and the entertainment industry. Together with his partner Tino Schädler, he's creating production designs for feature films, commercials, event design, or architecture. And this is why we invited you, Michael. Your work is all about spaces that tell and frame stories. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for jumping in the middle of a huge project you are just starting in Los Angeles here to Babelsberg. And a very welcome to you. This is your place, Michael Brown from Optimist Design and his keynote, Shaping Narrative Worlds.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm also happy to be back in Berlin because I lived here for 10 years. But I think that Real, as they're supposed to do, shows that we do some sexy stuff, but it doesn't really talk so much about, what we really do, how we do it, and more importantly, why am I here? I think by most measures, I probably shouldn't be here. I think most of the audience here comes from backgrounds from either film or animation or 3D modeling, production, things like that, and that's not my background. I originally started off very much from the architectural sphere and have wandered over time. So I think my talk today in particular is to give you an idea of what my personal roadshow has been as I've migrated, and to talk about my personal take on how much the industry is changing, how much if we talk about sort of blurring boundaries or erasing borders, how so much of the pipeline of how we do architecture is changing. It's using the same sort of software and techniques, and also, I would say, ways of thinking of film to really change how we're creating it. So that's a little bit what I'm here to talk about. Optimist, I think we try to approach space in the broadest of terms, and by space I mean either architecture, as Peter mentioned, built space mixed with projections, with media, with lighting, to actual sets, either built or virtual or some combination between. So it's those larger ideas of how do we create emotion, how to create story, whether you come into the space physically as your body or whether you're doing it with a pair of Oculus Rift goggles. So I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself. I said I started as an architect, and probably you guys are thinking like, hey, that's pretty cool. Why didn't you stay as an architect? Like, that has a lot of creative content in it. But I think I was always quite frustrated in that field, because even though you think it's really all about design, I would say probably only 10% of architecture is design. The other 90% is meetings and filing. Probably you guys do it as well, but worrying about costs and making sure the client's happy and all these other things. And I just take example of the building behind me, which I hope a lot of the locals may know, a little segment from the Jewish Museum here, and that's a building that took 10 years. It probably, by some measures, got canceled 3 or 4 times, and it was just about the whole fight to actually get it built. And I think I've, over the years, been trying to find a way to increase that 10% design to 20%, to 30%, to 60%, and that's probably influenced a lot of me trying to get away from being a frustrated architect into being sort of a more universal designer. I think some of the processes I'm going to talk about today have been about fulfilling or trying to quench that that frustration and move on. Started, at least to talk about my time here, with this guy. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Daniel Libeskind at all. He did, as I said before, the Jewish Museum, and was probably the reason why I first was here. Did a lot of great architecture, great storyteller in architecture. But in the end, you know, for me, it was about being in Berlin, going to Tel Aviv, doing a building there, which, you know, was like a stacked pile of books, winning the World Trade Center competition for the master plan, moving to New York, working on that, and eventually working on being in charge of the Jewish Museum in San Francisco, which was completed about 5 years ago. So that was my architectural background, and I guess I had to really fundamentally reconsider, like, how do we work with technology? Because as exciting as those buildings are, as impactful as they are, in the end, it just comes down to how you think about space through the machine. And I take a really sort of funny picture of computers a long time ago, probably when I first started trying to get into this sort of digital pipeline back when Form Z was like version 1.4 or something. And the problems I found with that was very much still thinking of space in, I would say, Cartesian terms, projected terms, like X and Y axes, and looking at things from the outside, still very abstract, as architecture always was. Keeping a picture up here of sort of this idea of 2D projection. And I think none of us experience space that way. You know, we experience it from a single point of view, in perspective, in motion, and it's always been sort of a fight to try to figure out ways to bring that very natural experience into not only how we experience the finished product, but how we design it from the onset. So I'd say, you know, now it's physically happened. I've moved to LA, but for a long time I've been sort of trying, my brain's been moving psychologically more towards LA, towards Hollywood, to the design, production, and ideas of film. So I'm going to go through a few different projects of things that I've sort of been stealing over the years and trying to build up, and has now come into our praxis of what we're doing now at Optimist. So this is a really sort of the first toe in the pool of film. I was doing this while I was still working very much in architecture. One smaller film set here from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory that then very much influenced how we actually move from the film world to the built world afterwards. Can I get the next film segment, please?
Here, put these on quick and don't take them off whatever you do. This light could burn your eyeballs right out of your skulls. And we certainly don't want that, now do we? This is the testing room for my very latest and greatest invention, television chocolate. One day it occurred to me, hey, if television can break up a photograph into millions and millions of tiny little pieces and send it whizzing through the air, then reassemble it on the other end, why can't I do the same thing with chocolate? Why can't I send a real...
So that was, on one hand, spatially very interesting. I mean, it's very much different than the rooms we're used to, which are sort of boxes with sides, and it came down to creating this sort of iconic rounded space, but it also was a big production challenge. Can we go back to the slide here? There we go. So it really came down to, and these are the illustrations from the design there, trying to figure out how we actually produce all these tiles. In the end, it was the big experience for me to come down to not having, you know, guys with saws and hammers and nails build stuff, but actually to CNC mill all of these panels, have it be basically driven directly off of our CAD files to build this great round space where you can see all the tiling here. And it allowed to have sort of these two rooms that flowed into one another to have this very dynamic space coming through. And that was, you know, interesting, nice design set, but for me it influenced something that we did in our architectural work right afterwards. This is for Raiffeisen Bank. They have a sort of thing that they have, each of their branches is designed by local architects, so they don't just, you know, have one corporate entity they bring across, and it should be very much grounded in place. And so this was near the Kreuzplatz in Zurich, and area, especially in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, was very culturally active. So our idea was basically to take sort of abstract portraits of the people who had lived there. You know, you had Richard Wagner had lived there, you had Albert Einstein had lived there, and actually to take their faces and use that as sort of a mural to paint the walls, which called for sort of a new way to produce it. We couldn't just do it sort of manually. We had to actually be able to take and alter in real time these pictures and compose them and move doors here and bring in air conditioning, all those things. And so we actually used some of the exact same techniques that we had been using for, you know, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, produce that set to actually mill all these pieces out of corian, which is sort of a mineral plata, and to actually do all the wall spaces, backlight them. Actually, we're able to do very complex shapes from the patterning itself to sort of bending and rounding and doing 5 mil axial CNC work to bring this to life. So I think what I want to give there is that that was one thing where, from a production point of view, we're actually able to take some of the ideas that we had developed for the film and actually bring it into creating a space where we're trying to tell a story about an area of a city, and to do that in a very sort of conventional, decorative interior way. So to move away from the architectural world and go back into sort of the film world, this is a commercial from, I think, from 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and was for me a real wake up of, you know, moving from architecture where you very much are the master builder and you're expected to do every single step of your own from beginning to the end. And, you know, as you guys know, film is much more collaborative than that. It's much more about sort of building up these different layers of design and input onto the final product. So. I'm not sure if you guys remember this commercial. If you've seen it, you probably do. Great in the sense that it is almost a beautiful short film. It doesn't really tell you, like, this product's great, it will make you more sexy, more happy, anything. It just tries to wake you up through surrealism because we're all so overloaded in what we see every day that after a while you just don't want to take on the normal messages. So, you know, from our design point of view, it's really interesting to approach it as sort of an anti-architectural project that, you know, normally we really try to have very clear lines, clear ideas, clear spaces, you know, contemporary sort of urban design, trying to build big buildings, but, you know, this was not about, you know, creating the perfect Stadtbild, perfect picture of the city, but actually really much more about, you know, how do we go in and afterwards and wreck it? You know, how do we add texture, fire, break it down? You know, these are some sketches in the meantime, like, no, more, tear that out, you know, bring this down, have a little bit more fire through there. And so that was sort of the first layer of taking architecture and then, you know, destroying it further. And for the first time, and there's sort of what we end up with as a result, just one still from it. And, you know, it's also really, as far as the process, that you're never actually producing the finished product yourself. You know, in this case, this is sort of was probably middle stand of how we're working on it, really developing both in 3D model, figuring out where the shots are being taken from, how do we shape the space to really frame in what we want around it, and working in very rough, loose terms to just figure out where things are opening up and where we're positioning the major character pieces, and then working with conceptual artists to take these sort of rough geometries and ideas and working much more with reference images to produce sort of the end illustrations of the design. So you can see sort of the change that when we came down to sort of the finished product here for it. And then the final layer on top of that is working with the concept artists as well to develop the individual actors, even if they are just, you know, not real people, they're just appearing in CG. So you had these sort of these are sort of the evil alien robot groups, which we had sort of fighting the sort of Halo-inspired, more space age human pieces in it. And then you had the final piece, actually the live action. And so filmed in a very small area. I mean, it was in the first image I showed where it's blocked out. There was sort of only one area that was done with live actors, with green screens, and actually these guys, and I would say the final element is that they were amazing dancers that got filmed and then had their faces then digitally added afterwards. So let's have the next film, please.
Party rock! I'm shuffling.
So yeah, sometimes design can be fun and light, even though there's a lot of work to get there. That's how I've watched the thing so many times, but it's always really a ton of fun to come back to it. So that's also what we're doing. I would just take a little break and say in the meantime, like, how we design things, whether they end up being sort of built spaces or commercials, they're the same. We start off with the same fundamental pieces of figuring out, what is the story? Sometimes it's written as a script. Sometimes it's, a conversation with a client. Sometimes it's, looking at a product and finding out what is the inspiring story behind that, and then trying to figure out how we tell that story, both through built form, how you view it, and potentially how it changes. A lot of the architecture, as you think of it conventionally, is really static. Maybe you turn the lights on, turn the lights off, how the light from the sun goes across it changes it. But the field that we're working in now gives us also the opportunity to think of the architecture as something that's movable and changing, which leads me to the next project I want to talk about here, is sort of the idea of the media activation as the space itself. And this is a project that we did for Nike. I don't know if you guys remember the Fuel Band. It was the hot thing also 3 years ago when it came out. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically one of these, I could say it encourages you to be more fitness-oriented, but it's basically an activity or motion tracker. And what I would say is the key beautiful element about that is that it's just really a black band with these LEDs embedded in it. And if you don't turn it on, you see nothing. It's sort of simple, smooth, clean, and when you pressed it, it would either, as you can see up here, have a display that would tell you the time, tell you how many fuel points you have burned in a particular day, and then you set your goals, and it goes, as you see across the bottom there, it goes from red when you're not very active to green, and it rewards you, says you're a great person, all this sort of thing. So just a little bit of background so you know what it's about, otherwise it won't make any sense what I'm talking about as far as the project. So, we got hired by Nike to do a big activation at South by Southwest. If there's anybody from the States here who knows, it's really started off originally as a very big music festival, but has become sort of, a big festival for all things cultural and also big in the branding space. And they want to use it for sort of a retail showroom during the day and of course, for a concert space at night. And we just got basically a big, somewhat beat up old industrial space in downtown Austin, Texas, where it takes place. And they said, well, what would you do with it? And our first thing was to say, like, well, you got a black band with some LEDs. That's a really good starting point. So what we really did was we actually created, I would say, really very much a stage set around the inside, did a big black oval, which could be a concert venue for people, for up to 500 people, and then lined all the walls with programmable LEDs. So it could be set by DJs for dancing, and also could be used separately during the day. You rolled all the furniture out. So I think the key piece there was the idea that the people themselves influence the architecture. In the same way that you have, if you're wearing the Fuel Band yourself, the more you move, it changes the colors. So the idea that we'd have these programmable LED walls, which, could be sort of the low energy red, and then through programming, would then light up the space. So that actually had the influence as far as, that's actually the build project there. The idea that at night it could be fully programmable, which we did with a VJ who would control it, by the music, and you unfortunately can't really bring it to light with the stills here, but you'd really have, like it would move around you like a sea. Sometimes it would react by, as the music would slow down, it would go more into the red zone and then come back up to the green when they were really hitting it. And you had sort of just these amazing color changes going on there. So that's some images of what it looked like as a concert venue itself. And then during the day, exactly, we'd have areas when, between acts, when it was waiting, depending on how much people were moving around, it would develop hot spots. The area where there was the most action, we get sort of more green, or people were sort of more mellow. And if you got a whole group to start moving along, it would we had motion sensors, up along the top that we'd stole from some Connects that would sort of track it. And so people, if they really got going, you could actually then change your area of the wall. Sort of as a little entertainment thing was going on. And then change, as I said, during the day. They would clear all the stage out of there and then use it as a retail area to actually fit people with these bands and show them how to use it. So moving back to the film world, this is something, another commercial for Acura, with the idea that their cars are somehow purebred, that they are, as the tagline says, more than the machine. And so we worked from the script. It came down to a sort of very, in our taste, sort of futuristic horse racing, and trying to develop these things in terms of having the overall. Actually, let me go back one more. Trying to figure out what the elements were that we wanted to repeat, the overall stadium, which was all done in CG, as well as how we could integrate the I'd say, built elements with the CG elements in a way that was very believable. So go with the next film, please.
Performance that changes the game, a power that goes beyond the machine.
Yeah, unfortunately, the horse has to turn into a car at the end because they got to sell cars. But I think the part as far as designing the sets for the stadium and for the horses themselves actually was probably the most interesting part. It sort of brings sort of the other part that I want to talk about, how our brains have to shift a little bit. Architecture really think about things as sort of fully built space, and I think that there's a lot of people who also, I was talking to some others, really work in almost completely CG generated. And this was very much about how do we figure out how do we effectively build parts. How do we bring in CG mostly for the pieces that are moving, which you can add motion blur and actually add believability to it, and how do we combine those? So you see sort of the beginning pieces here as far as doing the corral, and that was something that we built out the opening gates so they would come out, whereas all the horses were completely CG generated. And therefore, we could actually then sort of, with the motion blur, bring that across in a really believable way. And then the whole stadium sort of thing there. Again, even though it's only sort of a few moments of film that comes into it, there's sort of a lot of work that goes on as far as, figuring out what the stadium is. Sort of in this case, a really sort of simple, slick, Tron-inspired, all about motion and dynamicism. For the racetrack itself, as well as building up this whole sort of cityscape behind it, working very much within architectural convention then to have sort of it glow and look a little bit futuristic, but be very much of the known world and have the stadium be the one part that is very special within that. And so these are sort of the pieces of how we really work to develop these. Everything we're doing at 100% in 3D and giving it out. In the meantime, actually, we're able to give our 3D models directly over to fabricators to build them. So it's a little bit dark, unfortunately, but sort of lights across there showing all the call-outs for the details that we build, sort of those parts there giving basic dimensions, and then they basically just mill it all out. So you can see here in production when they were building it up on the stage set with the pieces here with the doors opening, all out of wood before all the elements were added for the lighting, and then the final product there. And the goal of that, even though we were doing the horses in CG, was to actually have these elements, because there's a certain imperfection and roughness and rawness to things when they're built. They don't look like you had actually planned every corner, and there's accidents and how light comes across, and that's very, very important for believability. So that's why we were building up the opening gates there in 3D, and then we also did elements of the stands. So again, the process of how we work, as I said, just for those who aren't familiar with it, building up everything mostly in Maya, which is also animation, but of the tool sets that's there, we're using maybe a very, very small portion of it, but mostly because it actually gives us the chance to really go in and study things very detailed and actually know what we're gonna get. But the set build-up of how we designed it, sort of then moving on to texturing and lighting, to the final built project that was filmed at night in an existing stadium, and then we actually just cloned it and brought that all across for the CG pieces of it, and then going down to, even if you don't see them, like these very, very small details, those are little bedding stations there that the people are sitting at, just because even if it's just a quarter of a second, half a second, if you can add sort of edges and light and believability and reflections, that's super important for the storytelling, even if it's only something that's going to appear on film. And then, of course, the last element, the same thing, is always about sort of character development, working again with a conceptual artist to develop what do the horses look like? How do we translate the individual brands, the competitor brands, I might say, into horses? And for the most part, that was giving them grills, and as you do as also a car, you have the BMW with the kidney grills, you have sort of the Lexus with their power grill, and just giving little hints across as who those belong without really talking too much about the competitors there. So, last project, I'm just going to bring it back home because it's something that just opened here. I'm not sure if you guys are aware. There's Red Bull Studios, part of Red Bull's mission. I think everybody knows about, people jumping out of space and, flying planes and all that. Very active in the extreme sport field. But Red Bull is also active in the music market, so to say, as part of their sort of deep branding strategy. So these are opened 4 weeks ago in Berlin. Everybody knows the town. It's in the Umspannungswerk in Kreuzberg, near the Paul-Lincke-Ufer, and basically inside of a beautiful 1920s modern brick building, or modern for the 1920s. And the approach was very simple, or was seen as very simple from Red Bull. They'd seen it originally as sort of a really utilitarian space, sort of funny little boxes in there where we add a bunch of hanging pieces to get the acoustics to work right. And I think we tried to approach it in a very integral way. And I think there was 3 major elements. One, designing from perspective, and there's somehow a glass set of windows where you can see through all the spaces, even though they're very complex. Had a lot to do with integrating the acoustics, not to see the acoustics as a problem of something that has to be cleaned away, but actually as an inspiration for the overall form, and to really turn the whole thing into a big playground to climb upon. And then finally, the message of what is modern creative Berlin about. And in this case, it was somehow like the perfect metaphor for us about how you have all these unused industrial spaces. Previously it housed these huge machines because you needed these as transformers to break down energy. And what used to take basically half a city block has become reduced to something that you could fit in half of this space. And so you have the emptying out of the former industrial spaces, which are being taken over by and being used for creatives in this town. I think that's part of the reason why Berlin has bloomed so much. So originally they had seen it as something that was a series of boxes, and what we tried to do was actually sculpt what we needed for the acoustics in this sort of prismatic fractal form, which is about breaking up, distributing the sound, into one larger piece, and then to add stair elements where you can come and climb up on top of it and sit up on top of it. And then to really work out what ended up being a far more complicated structural solution to get that down, where we had to break all the pieces down into steel, and you can sort of see the overall form here and how that created out. And then the final space. So this is the recording space inside where they play. You have different drum booths, things like that off on the side, and you can see how we had to shape for the acoustic the outside spaces, which have this sort of broken thing to diffuse it, where we weren't allowed to have any surface areas that were contiguous larger than 3 square meters. So that flowed through the interior spaces. Another one here, that's the control room, which we did black. You can't really see the ceiling, but it's also sort of broken up and integrated with some lighting. But the key part was how we dealt with the outside of it. And that came down to trying to draw inspiration from this sort of physical infrastructure with this power station used to be. It used to be, driven by conduit machines and copper. So we said, let's really use that as our sort of facade material, and we ended up using 1.1 kilometers of copper band to wrap the whole outside, which is also great because, when the musicians are recording, they don't get calls from their managers or anything else because you can't get any cell reception inside there. So it ended up being sort of a very beautiful piece that we worked out. You can see here sort of how it flows through on the inside of the control rooms, put in a new concrete floor, concrete steps and all that. But it really just came down to trying to visualize and also work out the fabrication things here, where we could figure out and actually feed in information for the backing on this, because all the walls are angled, and then calculate the exact amount of material we need and have them cut it nearly to length and bring it on site and bring it in with, I don't know what it was something like 12,000 copper rivets. So just to sum up, I've gone through a lot of different projects. Hopefully you have some, bit broader idea of what we're doing. And I think if I leave you with anything, it'd be the thought that it used to be that our professions were very much driven by special knowledge, access to technology or technique. And so much of the things that I've been trying to pull out of in the last years at the film industry have been to fight against that, to move, as I think we all are sort of doing, to a more universal designer, where we think about space not in terms of how it's produced, but what we want it to be, being freed up as storytellers, and then moving beyond things that frustrate us to realize our full potential. So, thank you very much. So I'm not sure, I think, no time for questions? I don't think we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. Michael, you're with us some hours, and if anyone has questions to Michael, just use the opportunity to do so. For me as a line producer, it's amazing what kind of narrative worlds you can just build up, and that this is something which is starting in your mind, and that you can just implement it. Then it's really great.